Imagine this carefully. You're in the middle of a conversation, maybe even an argument. You feel confident. Not just slightly confident, but certain. Your thoughts feel clear, your reasoning feels solid, and everything inside you is aligned with the idea that you are right. There's no hesitation. No doubt your mind feels stable. Then something happens. The other person shows you something, maybe a simple fact, maybe a piece of evidence, maybe just a line of reasoning so clear that you can't ignore it. And in a very quiet, almost uncomfortable moment, something shifts. You realize you're wrong. Not partially wrong. Not in a way you can easily explain away. Completely wrong. That moment is strange. If you pay attention closely, it doesn't feel like just changing your mind. It feels deeper than that. There is a kind of internal pause, almost like the system inside you hesitates. For a brief second, your thoughts don't move forward. They stall. What just happened there? Most people would describe it in a simple way. They would say, I just updated my belief, as if the mind works like a computer. Remove the wrong file, replace it with a correct one, and continue normally. But that description is misleading. Your mind is not a storage device where ideas sit independently, waiting to be replaced. It is not a clean system where information can be swapped without consequences. What you experienced in that moment was not a simple update. It was a disruption, because the belief that was just proven wrong was not sitting alone. It was connected to other thoughts, other assumptions, other conclusions you had already built over time. That one idea was part of a larger structure. So when it breaks, something else happens. The structure around it feels unstable. This is why the moment of being wrong feels heavier than it logically should. On the surface, it's just one idea being corrected. But internally, it's not one idea, it's a small piece of a much larger system that suddenly doesn't fit together the same way anymore. And your mind notices that immediately. Even before you consciously analyze it, there's a subtle reaction, a hesitation, a discomfort, sometimes even a slight resistance. Not because you enjoy being wrong, but because something inside you is trying to maintain stability. Your brain is constantly trying to keep your understanding of the world consistent. It builds a working model of reality, something that helps you predict what will happen next, how people will behave, how situations will unfold. That model doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be stable enough to function. When you are proven wrong, that stability is briefly disturbed. For a moment, your model of reality has a gap in it, and that gap is not just an intellectual problem. It feels like uncertainty. The world becomes slightly less predictable than it was a few seconds ago. Something you relied on no longer works. That is why the experience is not neutral. It is not just learning. It is a moment where your internal structure, the thing you use to understand everything, has to adjust itself in real time. And that adjustment is not smooth. It is slow, uneven, and sometimes uncomfortable, because the mind is not just trying to find the truth. It is trying to rebuild stability at the same time. So the moment you realize you are wrong is not a simple correction. It is the beginning of a reconstruction process inside your mind. To understand what happens next, you have to change how you think about the mind itself. It's tempting to imagine the brain as something like a library or a hard drive, where ideas are stored separately and can be taken out or replaced one by one. But that picture is too simple. It doesn't match how thinking actually works. A better way to think about the mind is as a network. Not a collection of isolated points, but a system of connections. Every belief you hold is linked to many others. Some connections are strong, built over years of repetition and experience. Others are weaker, more flexible, easier to change. But almost nothing stands alone. So when one belief is challenged, it doesn't just sit there quietly, waiting to be evaluated. It sends tension through the network. Other ideas connected to it begin to feel uncertain as well, even if you're not fully aware of it. Imagine a spider web. If you touch one part of the web, the vibration travels across the entire structure. The web doesn't break immediately, but it responds everywhere. That's closer to how your mind behaves. A single challenge belief creates a disturbance that spreads. Or think of it as a house of cards. Each card supports others in ways that are not always obvious. If you remove one card, the question is not simply whether that card was correct. The real question is whether the surrounding structure can still hold its shape. Sometimes nothing collapses, sometimes a small section shifts, and sometimes, unexpectedly, a larger part becomes unstable. This is why being proven wrong can feel disproportionate to the size of the mistake. Logically, it might seem like a small correction, but structurally, it may affect many other things you believe. For example, consider a belief about something simple like how people behave in a certain situation. That belief might be connected to past experiences, assumptions about human nature, expectations about the future, and even decisions you've made based on it. When that one belief is challenged, all those connected ideas are indirectly affected. Your mind then faces a problem. It has to decide what to do with this disturbance. Should it isolate the issue and adjust only that one belief? Should it re-examine the connected ideas? Or should it resist the change to preserve the overall structure? This decision is not made consciously in a clear, step-by-step way. It happens as a dynamic process across the network. Some parts of the mind may begin to update, while others resist. This creates internal tension, a kind of cognitive imbalance that you can sometimes feel as confusion or discomfort. Another important detail is that not all beliefs are equal in this network. Some are central. They connect to many other ideas and play a large role in how you interpret the world. Others are more peripheral, with fewer connections and less influence. When a peripheral belief is proven wrong, the effect is small and localized. But when a central belief is challenged, the impact spreads much more widely. This explains why certain disagreements feel trivial, while others feel deeply unsettling. It's not just about the content of the belief. It's about its position in the network. Over time, as you think, learn, and experience, this network becomes more complex. Connections multiply, patterns strengthen, and certain pathways become dominant. This allows for faster thinking and stronger intuition. But it also means that any disruption has more pathways to travel through. So when someone proves you wrong, what actually happens is not a simple correction. It is a disturbance in a highly interconnected system. The mind must absorb that disturbance, redistribute it, and eventually reorganize itself to restore balance. And this reorganization takes time. It is not immediate, not clean, and not always visible, but it is essential because without it, the structure would either collapse or become rigid and unable to adapt. Being wrong, in this sense, is not just about replacing a bad idea. It is about reshaping a network that has been built over years, sometimes decades of thinking. Now consider what happens at a deeper level before you even have time to think clearly about the situation. The moment a belief is challenged, there is an immediate reaction in the brain that is not logical in the way we usually imagine thinking to be. It is fast, automatic, and largely outside conscious control. Your brain is not primarily designed to seek truth. It is designed to maintain a stable model of the world so that you can function, predict, and survive. Accuracy matters, but stability often comes first. A slightly wrong but stable model can still help you navigate daily life. A completely uncertain model, even if it might eventually lead to better accuracy, is harder to operate with in the moment. So when a belief is proven wrong, the brain does not calmly celebrate the correction. Instead, it detects a kind of internal conflict. Something that was previously reliable is now unreliable. A prediction has failed, and that failure creates a signal. This signal can be thought of as a form of error detection. The brain constantly compares what it expects with what actually happens. When the two don't match, it generates a mismatch signal. You can think of it like a system that says, something is off. The model needs attention, but this signal is not neutral. It often comes with a feeling, discomfort, tension, sometimes even a slight sense of threat, not because you are in danger, but because your internal system has lost a bit of its reliability. To make this clearer, imagine walking in a familiar place in the dark. You think you know where everything is. You take a step expecting the floor to be there, but suddenly there is a small drop you didn't anticipate. Even if it's not dangerous, your body reacts instantly. There's a jolt, a brief moment of alarm. Your prediction failed. Something similar happens in the mind when a belief fails. The floor of your expectation is suddenly not where you thought it was. This is why people often react defensively when proven wrong. The reaction is not purely intellectual. It is tied to this deeper system that monitors consistency and prediction. Before you consciously analyze the evidence, your brain has already registered a mismatch and generated a response. Another important point is that this reaction happens very quickly, much faster than deliberate reasoning. By the time you start forming arguments or explanations, the initial response has already influenced your thinking. It may push you to reject the new information, reinterpret it, or look for ways to preserve your existing belief. This is not necessarily a flaw. It is part of how the system maintains stability. If every small contradiction forced an immediate and complete update, the mind would become unstable, constantly shifting without a reliable structure. So the brain balances two competing needs, the need to stay stable and the need to stay accurate. When a belief is challenged, these two needs come into conflict. Stability pushes you to resist change. Accuracy pushes you to update. The outcome depends on many factors: how strong the evidence is, how important the belief is, how much emotional weight it carries, and how flexible your overall system is. What we still don't fully understand is how the brain decides when to allow a belief to change and when to resist it. We can observe the patterns. We can see that some people update quickly while others resist strongly. But the exact mechanism, the detailed process by which the brain balances stability and accuracy, is still not completely clear. What is clear is that being proven wrong is not just a logical event, it is a biological one. It involves systems that evolved long before formal reasoning, systems concerned with prediction, consistency, and control. So when you feel that immediate resistance, that slight discomfort or tension, it is not simply a failure of reasoning. It is a signal that your internal model has encountered something it cannot easily absorb. And before any conscious correction can happen, the brain must first deal with that disruption. Even after that initial reaction settles, something more subtle begins to happen. You might think that once you recognize the evidence and accept that you were wrong, the process is complete. The incorrect belief is removed, the correct one is installed, and everything continues smoothly. But the mind does not reorganize itself that quickly. Beliefs are not just isolated conclusions, they are compressed forms of experience. Over time, the brain takes repeated observations, patterns, and outcomes and condenses them into simple statements or assumptions that are easy to use. These compressed beliefs act like shortcuts. Instead of analyzing every situation from scratch, the mind relies on them to make fast decisions. When one of these compressed beliefs is proven wrong, the problem is not just that the conclusion was incorrect. The compression itself becomes questionable. All the experiences that were grouped together under that belief now need to be reconsidered. The brain has to ask a more difficult question. What did I misunderstand when I formed this pattern? To see how complex this is, imagine you have spent years believing something like, people who work hard succeed. That belief is not just a sentence. It is built from many observations, stories you've heard, examples you've seen, maybe your own experiences. Over time, your brain compresses all of that into a simple rule. Now suppose you are shown clear examples where this rule fails. People who worked hard but did not succeed. Situations where effort did not lead to the expected outcome. The belief breaks, but the underlying experiences remain. They do not disappear. The brain must now reorganize them into a new structure. This is not an instant process. It requires reclassification. Some experiences may still support a modified version of the belief. Others may contradict it. The brain begins to sort, separate, and rebuild a more accurate pattern. During this phase, things feel uncertain. The old simplicity is gone, but the new structure is not fully formed. This is why people often hesitate even after accepting they are wrong. It is not just doubt about the new idea. It is the mind working through the consequences of the change. The previous belief provided a clean, stable explanation. The new understanding is often more complex, less certain, and harder to apply. There is also a tendency for the mind to try to preserve as much of the old structure as possible. Instead of completely abandoning a belief, it may modify it slightly to reduce the disruption. For example, instead of discarding the idea that hard work leads to success, the brain might adjust it to something like, hard work usually leads to success, but not always. This allows the system to maintain continuity while still incorporating new information. This gradual adjustment shows that belief revision is not a simple replacement. It is a reconstruction process. The brain is not just updating a statement. It is reorganizing a network of compressed experiences into a new pattern that better fits reality. Another important aspect is that this reconstruction happens unevenly. Some parts of the network update quickly, especially those directly connected to the challenged belief. Other parts take longer, particularly those that are more distant or less frequently used. As a result, for a period of time, your thinking may be inconsistent. In some situations, you apply the new understanding. In others, the old pattern still influences your reaction. This creates a temporary state where both the old and new beliefs coexist. You may logically agree with the new idea, but still feel or react according to the old one. This is not a contradiction in the usual sense. It is a sign that the reconstruction is still in progress. Over time, as the new pattern is used more often, it becomes stronger. The connections supporting it are reinforced, and the old pattern gradually weakens. The system stabilizes again, but now in a slightly different form. So when you are proven wrong, the mind does not simply correct an error. It begins a process of reorganizing compressed experience, reclassifying patterns, and rebuilding its internal structure to restore stability with greater accuracy. Even after this reconstruction begins, there is another layer that makes the process more complicated. The mind is not only updating beliefs about the world, it is also maintaining a sense of continuity about itself. In other words, your beliefs are not separate from your identity. They are part of how you understand who you are. Over time, certain beliefs become tied to your self-image. If you see yourself as logical, informed, or capable of understanding things correctly, then your beliefs act as evidence for that identity. They reinforce the idea that your thinking is reliable. So when one of those beliefs is proven wrong, the effect is not limited to the belief itself. It can extend to how you see yourself. This creates a deeper form of resistance. The mind is no longer just deciding whether a belief is accurate. It is also protecting a sense of identity that has been built over years. Changing the belief may require adjusting that identity, even if only slightly. And that adjustment is not always easy. To understand this, imagine that over time you have built an internal narrative. I am someone who understands how things work. This narrative is supported by many smaller beliefs and experiences. Now, when a belief is proven wrong, it introduces a contradiction. If you were confident and yet incorrect, what does that say about the reliability of your thinking? The mind now faces two parallel tasks. One is to update the belief to better match reality. The other is to maintain a coherent sense of self. Sometimes these two tasks align easily, but in many cases they create tension. One way the mind resolves this tension is by minimizing the importance of the error. It may treat the mistake as an exception rather than a sign that the underlying belief system needs adjustment. Another approach is to reinterpret the new information in a way that preserves the original belief as much as possible. This is not necessarily a conscious decision. It is part of the system's attempt to reduce internal conflict. There is also a social dimension to this process. Many beliefs are not formed in isolation. They are shaped by interactions with others, by shared ideas, and by group identity. Being proven wrong in a private setting is one thing. Being proven wrong in front of others adds another layer. Now, the mind is not only dealing with internal consistency, but also with how it is perceived externally. In such situations, the cost of updating a belief can feel higher. Accepting the correction may feel like losing status, credibility, or authority. This increases the pressure to resist, even when the evidence is clear. Again, this is not simply irrational behavior. It reflects the fact that beliefs are embedded in a broader system that includes social relationships and self-perception. At the same time, there is a limit to how much resistance can be maintained. If the evidence is strong and repeated, the mind eventually has to adjust. But the adjustment may be gradual. Instead of a sudden shift, the belief weakens over time. The certainty attached to it decreases. Alternative explanations begin to form. Slowly, the internal structure changes. During this period, it is common to experience a gap between what you consciously accept and what you intuitively feel. You may agree that a belief is incorrect, but still react as if it were true in certain situations. This happens because the deeper patterns associated with the old belief have not yet been fully reorganized. With repeated exposure to the new understanding, the balance shifts. The new belief becomes more integrated into the network. It connects with other ideas, supports predictions, and begins to function as part of the system. The old belief, no longer reinforced, gradually fades. What is important here is that being proven wrong is not just an intellectual correction. It is a process that involves identity, social context, and the need for internal consistency. The mind is not only trying to become more accurate, it is trying to remain coherent while it changes. This is why the experience can feel complex and sometimes uncomfortable. It is not just about replacing one idea with another. It is about adjusting a system that includes how you understand the world and how you understand yourself within it. After enough of these moments, being corrected, adjusting, rebuilding, something larger begins to emerge. The mind does not simply accumulate corrected beliefs. It gradually changes the way it relates to its own thinking. The process of being wrong, repeated over time, reshapes not just what you believe, but how you handle belief itself. At first, each instance of being wrong feels like a disruption. It interrupts stability, creates discomfort, and forces reconstruction. But over many repetitions, the system begins to adapt to this pattern. It becomes slightly less resistant, slightly more flexible, not perfectly open, but less fragile. This shift is subtle. It does not happen as a clear decision. It happens through repeated exposure to correction. Each time a belief is updated, the mind learns something about the process itself. It begins to recognize that instability is temporary, that reconstruction is possible, and that losing a belief does not collapse the entire system. As a result, the relationship between stability and accuracy starts to change. In the beginning, stability is prioritized strongly. The system resists change to avoid disruption, but over time, if corrections are integrated successfully, the system becomes more tolerant of temporary instability. It allows more room for updating because it has learned that the structure can recover. This leads to an important transformation. The mind becomes less attached to individual beliefs and more focused on the process of maintaining a workable model of reality. Instead of treating each belief as something that must be defended, it begins to treat beliefs as tools, useful when they work, replaceable when they do not. However, this transformation is never complete. Even after decades of thinking, the mind still relies on structures that feel stable. It still forms patterns, compresses experiences, and builds models that it depends on. The difference is not that attachment disappears, but that it becomes more flexible in some areas and remains rigid in others. There is also a limit to how much correction the system can handle at once. If too many beliefs are challenged simultaneously, the structure can become overwhelmed. The mind may then respond by simplifying, ignoring certain inputs, or retreating to more familiar patterns. This shows that the process of updating is not unlimited. It has constraints based on cognitive capacity and the need for coherence. Another important aspect is that even with repeated correction, the mind never reaches a final, perfectly accurate model of reality. Every belief, no matter how refined, is still a simplification. It captures patterns that are useful, but it does not fully represent the complexity of the world. There are always details left out, assumptions made, and uncertainties ignored. This means that the process of being wrong never truly ends. It is not something that happens only when you make a clear mistake. It is an ongoing condition of having a mind that builds models of reality. Those models are always incomplete, always subject to revision, and always slightly misaligned with the full structure of the world. What we do not fully understand is how the brain manages this ongoing process so effectively. Despite constant inaccuracies and corrections, It maintains a sense of continuity. It allows you to function, make decisions, and navigate the world without being overwhelmed by uncertainty. The mechanisms behind this balance between stability, flexibility, and accuracy are still not completely clear. What is clear is that being proven wrong plays a central role in this system. It is not an occasional failure. It is part of the mechanism that allows the mind to refine itself over time. Without it, beliefs would remain fixed, and the model of reality would drift further away from what it is trying to represent. So over years and decades, what changes is not just the content of your thinking, but the structure of how you deal with being wrong. The mind becomes a system that can absorb disruption, reorganize itself, and continue functioning even while knowing that its understanding is never complete. As this process continues over years and decades, a remarkable transformation occurs, one that is more profound than simply correcting individual beliefs. The mind gradually develops a meta-awareness of its own structures, an understanding of how it constructs knowledge, forms expectations, and organizes experience. Each instance of being proven wrong contributes not only to the refinement of specific ideas, but also to the gradual evolution of the mind's architecture itself. Over time, repeated exposure to correction teaches the brain a subtle truth. Beliefs are not absolute. They are tools, models, approximations of a complex reality that is too vast to know perfectly. Each belief serves a purpose, but it is provisional. This recognition changes the way the mind approaches information. It becomes slightly less rigid, more capable of integrating new data without destabilizing the entire system. It develops resilience, a capacity to absorb error and restructure itself while maintaining overall coherence. This adaptation is not purely intellectual. It is also emotional and social. When you have experienced being wrong multiple times, the initial shock or discomfort diminishes. You no longer perceive correction solely as a threat, but as a signal, a necessary disruption that guides refinement. Similarly, the social pressures that once amplified resistance to being wrong lose some of their intensity, because the mind has learned that survival and functionality do not depend on never being incorrect. The model of reality becomes dynamic, able to flex and adjust without collapsing. At the same time, the mind structure becomes more sophisticated. It builds layered patterns of understanding where beliefs are not isolated but interdependent. Connections strengthen between ideas that support each other, while weak or unsupported patterns fade. The system prioritizes predictive utility over rigid correctness. This is why experienced thinkers often have intuition that seems instantaneous or effortless. What appears as intuition is actually the accumulated effect of a deeply interconnected network that has been shaped, challenged, and refined over decades. Yet even after decades of refinement, the mind remains inherently imperfect. Every model, every belief, every framework is still an approximation. No matter how many corrections occur, there will always be gaps, uncertainties, and areas where understanding is incomplete. The process is endless because reality itself is complex and often ambiguous. What changes is not perfection, but adaptability, the ability to function effectively while continuously revising understanding. Being proven wrong repeatedly also fosters a profound philosophical insight. The world you perceive is mediated through the lens of your accumulated experience and beliefs. Reality itself has not changed, but your understanding of it has shifted incrementally with each correction. You begin to recognize that your experience of reality is always partly constructed by your own cognitive architecture. This does not make perception meaningless. It makes it relational, contextual, and dynamic. Your mind participates in shaping the reality you experience by selecting, interpreting, and organizing the input it receives. Ultimately, this leads to a deep form of intellectual humility. Knowing that beliefs are provisional, that models are incomplete, and that errors are inevitable, you understand that being wrong is not a failure. It is the mechanism by which the mind approaches truth more closely. The discomfort, the resistance, the reconstruction, all of it is part of a process that allows the mind to align more accurately with the patterns of the world, even if never perfectly. Through this lens, the repeated experience of being proven wrong becomes a kind of internal training, a continuous exercise in refinement, adaptation, and self-correction. It teaches the mind not just new facts, but how to think, how to observe, and how to adjust. Over decades, this builds a mind that is more perceptive, more flexible, and more deeply aware of both the world and itself. It builds not just knowledge, but the capacity to navigate the uncertainty, complexity, and subtlety of reality in a way that is both scientifically rigorous and profoundly human. Once this process of repeated correction, reconstruction, and adaptation has been going on for years, it begins to influence not just individual thoughts, but the overall way the mind approaches reality. The mind develops a kind of meta-structure, a framework for understanding not only the world, but also how it understands the world. Each instance of being proven wrong is no longer just a disruption. It becomes a lesson in how to process disruption itself. Over time, this creates a mind that is less rigid, more resilient, and more capable of holding uncertainty without collapsing. This evolution changes the way you relate to your own beliefs. Instead of seeing beliefs as absolute truths that define reality, they are recognized as provisional tools, models built to predict outcomes, guide decisions, and compress experience into something usable. Some beliefs are strong and central, while others are weaker or more peripheral. The mind begins to understand that even its most deeply held convictions are conditional, valid only within the limits of current evidence and perspective. This awareness does not make the mind indecisive, it makes it adaptive. Decisions can still be made quickly, but with a recognition that they are based on a framework that is always subject to refinement. The process also fosters a subtle but profound shift in emotional response. When you are younger or less experienced, being proven wrong often triggers defensiveness, embarrassment, or frustration. These reactions are biological. They are tied to the system that values stability and coherence. Over time, however, repeated experiences with correction teach the mind that being wrong is not catastrophic. It becomes part of the rhythm of thinking, an expected and necessary mechanism for improvement. Discomfort still occurs, but it becomes manageable, and in many cases, it begins to signal opportunity rather than threat. Each challenge is a chance to refine understanding, to rebuild the network in a slightly more accurate form. There is also a social and cognitive integration that happens with this maturation. Beliefs are not formed in isolation. They are influenced by interactions with others, cultural norms, and shared knowledge. Experiencing correction in social context teaches the mind how to balance personal conviction with openness to external input. Over time, the mind learns to tolerate uncertainty in a way that preserves both integrity and adaptability. This does not mean abandoning judgment. It means exercising judgment within a system that is self-correcting and responsive to evidence. At a structural level, repeated updates strengthen the interconnections between beliefs that are reliable and weaken those that are not. This creates an increasingly sophisticated network where patterns are recognized faster, intuition becomes more accurate, and mental models are richer. The mind learns to simulate outcomes, anticipate consequences, and detect subtle inconsistencies without conscious effort. What appears as instantaneous insight is the cumulative effect of decades of trial, error, and correction operating within a refined structure. Yet the mind remains inherently imperfect. No system, no matter how refined, can fully represent the complexity of reality. The process of being wrong is ongoing, endless, and intrinsic to thinking itself. What changes over time is the mind's capacity to handle this process gracefully, to tolerate uncertainty, to integrate evidence, and to restructure itself without collapsing. In essence, the repeated experience of correction teaches the mind both humility and capability. Humility, because no belief is ever final, and capability, because each correction incrementally aligns the internal model closer to external patterns. This leads to a profound philosophical insight. Reality is never experienced in isolation from the mind. Each perception, each understanding is mediated by the structure built over years of thinking, learning, and revising. Being proven wrong is therefore not a mere event. It is a mechanism that gradually shapes the mind into a system capable of engaging with complexity, ambiguity, and nuance. Over time, the mind evolves not just in knowledge but in sophistication, adaptability, and awareness, becoming a mirror that reflects reality more faithfully while remaining aware of its own limitations.